Okay, let's do the qualitative study. I'm going to skip the first two columns. That's just information you cut and paste. Sadly, there was no conceptual or theoretical framework mentioned in this. This was a qualitative comparative case study. So let's go look at this. Qualitative research is extensive. That's all I have to say. There's a lot of information in these things. So if we start with the abstract, it tells us the background and what they were looking at, which is really important to kind of understand because these are new words to me and what they were kind of looking at. They're not new words, but how they put them in context. It was kind of hard for me to grasp. So it tells what this study actually explored, okay, related to interprofessional healthcare teams. And it really talked about role boundaries, the influences of role construction, and the implications for professionals and patients. This was a good study. The methods they used, it tells us what it is here in the abstract, okay? They talked about the analysis, the thematic content analysis, and they talk a little bit about the results. This is a nice abstract. And they talked about the conclusions. Backgrounds are critical. It really tells us what the heck they're talking about. It also told us what the study aimed to do. It tells us a little bit more about the primary healthcare team, and I like this because it says, in this study we focus on construction of role boundaries, blah, blah, blah. It tells us what they are examining specifically and what those things mean. Oh, something I wanted to say here. When we talk about variables, we need to define them, and this talked about what professional role construction was. It defined it right out there for us, okay? I highlighted salient points. I'm going to send you this article. It also talked about certain elements of the study. It defined them for us, and you'll find that important later on when you look at content or the analysis of the data. But the sentence I really liked that kind of spelled it out for me, what they were doing. What types of role boundaries are present within an IPE team, interprofessional team, and what are the influences on construction of roles and role boundaries? So right there, that tells us a lot of what they did. So here's our methods. It tells us it was a comparative case study. It tells us it was purposive sampling, which is what we do with qualitative studies, and quantitative. Let me see, it tells us about two teams. The case study came from comparative case study. Of course, they had two teams in to compare to each other, and they came from different provinces in Canada. And it tells us the characteristics of the population. Okay? So let me go back to the table really quickly. So the design and the method. This is a qualitative comparative case study. And what was done in the study was to understand role construction with interprofessional teams in primary care specifically, so not acute care settings, but primary care, and the types of role boundaries with the interprofessional team and influences on role construction and role boundaries. This was a very good article. I thought it was interesting. The sample and the setting, again, there was N26. It told us that somewhere. I think I cruised right over that. It's a purposive sample. There were 13 members for each of the teams. It explained that, and it was from Canada to different provinces. I like to know where the study was. And it doesn't matter, truthfully, when you're looking generally at studies. I mean, from any part of the world. It doesn't have, you don't look for things just from the United States. And the characteristics of the population is right here. So the major variables, what was easiest for me, I looked at this quickly, so I'm really sorry. This is kind of lame, but sometimes it's hard with the questions to determine what the heck the variable is, dependent or independent. And I pulled, for me it was easiest, hang on, to actually take these two questions and pull them right over to what they were trying to do with the study and the major variables. So what types of role boundaries, as a variable, are present within interprofessional team? These are two major variables. I didn't delineate them out, dependent and independent, because the way the question was asked, I should do that for you because that would come out in the content analysis, but I will tell you for this purposes, it's okay to write your major variables here. Sorry, Diane, that's what I'm telling them. And then I took the second question, what are the influences on the construction the construction of roles and role boundaries. So there's my variables there too. You're supposed to define your variables here, and I had to because I didn't understand, what they're really talking about. I mean, you have to put it in context of the study. So role construction, they defined it, and I put it in here. I also defined collaboration and autonomy because you'll see that they talk about it throughout the article. Okay. Let me see here. I'm going to go down to data collection. Remember, with qualitative studies, data collection and data analysis occur at the same time. So data was collected through the interviews, the observations, and written documents. So they had those three things, so that's what you bring right on over to here. This is all, let me see, they did interviews, observations, and they did it at team meetings. It was explained in the article, in their artifacts, their written documents, and they gave an example of the few. Okay, data analysis, of course we're not doing stats because this is qual. And they talk about thematic coding of the interview, the transcripts, of the interview transcripts, the lit review. They compared it back to the lit review, and they had pattern codes. They also did iterative intracase analysis using Atlas. I'll go over that. And they had emergent codes that, or codes, whatever, that emerged with the literature. So let me go right back to that. So this is their data analysis. So they coded them thematically. They had pattern codes that they used as well to go to higher levels of abstraction. They used Atlas. The process was iterative, which is critical for qualitative studies. You go over and over things. These guys actually did everything right in their analysis of their qualitative data because they talked about the emergent concepts. They talked about transparency, which I'm not going through, but just briefly, these are some things that you look at with qualitative studies. They did get ethics approval, which is awesome, and they mentioned that. Okay, so then the results. Again, we talked about the models, or the themes that emerged. They actually generated a model, which is really cool, and it's shown in the article. They categorized the roles as autonomous and collaborative, interchangeable, and differentiated. And remember, I stated sometimes I just didn't understand what they were talking about. So I put the definitions over here. Here's the collaboration definition and the autonomy definition. I didn't bring over the interchangeability and the differentiation, but I did highlight them here. Okay. So then they take this article and they break it into the two main variables, which is role boundaries, and they talk about them in collaborative and autonomous fashion. Here's their model. And then they talked about influences. So in the end, instead of trying to confuse you, I did write those questions, but the two major variables were role boundaries and influences, okay? And they broke the influences down into structural influences and I think interpersonal influences as well. I highlighted that, but I didn't bring it down. But I think whoever used this article is really looking at turnover and things like that. And they subcategorized out certain things. If you read through this article, I highlighted them. I'll send the article to you. Okay, so, yeah, here's individual influences as well. All right, let me go back to this table. So, if we're going to talk about study findings, remember the study findings need to tie back to the major variables. And we talked about role boundaries. And this was our interprofessional teams, which would actually be our independent variable, and this would be our DV, dependent variable. Okay, so development of model construction. Oh, development of a model of role construction. So they developed a full-on model, which is cool. That's our findings. So the roles were categorized, as I mentioned, autonomous or collaborative, and as interchangeable and differentiated, and I did define some of that down here. But what they found, I'm tying this back to my variable, was that roles, boundaries were advantageous to being supported by others in the professional folks. It increased professional satisfaction. That's what I'm trying to say here. There was also a discussion on patient implications in regards to this. I put this in here because I thought, well, what if I want to go back to the patient? So I know it's there, and I can go back to the article and find out specifically what they meant by that. Also, they talked about influences. Remember, here's our major variable, IV, about the influences on the construction of role boundaries described, and they described it in structural and interpersonal influences as well, and that's described much more in the article. So basically, in the end, the study showed insight into some influences. Let me see here, into the influences, and I explained a couple of them as well. This was a hard article, but it was a good article. Okay, so the point is I did go back and I looked at each major variable, which is role boundaries. We knew our interprofessional team, that's what we were talking about, and then the influences on the construction of the roles and role boundaries. So those are all of my major variables, and I tried to address each one of those. I swear I did in the findings. Okay, so let's talk about appraisal really quickly. All these things that need to be answered. So if we go here, hang on here. This talks about the implications for professionals and patients. This is really important because, again, this is our clinical significance for the paper. I'm sorry, I got caught up in reading it. And it talks about how the participants can benefit from things. It talks about specific things about confusion and all that types of things. Role boundaries. Okay. Oh, sorry. This is the discussion part. This was an interesting discussion. We get too territorial about our roles is what I'm thinking. So anyways, it goes through the whole discussion and the implications. My goodness. Okay, implications for practice. Finally, I'm getting down there. This tells us the clinical significance. This also discusses the limitations, okay? And I've highlighted them. It tells us about the conclusions. I'm going through this quickly because my time is running out. So here's the, let me see here. I just started out with limitations. This is caution with generalization or transferability because it was only 2 case studies and there was no control group, and we get all that. I actually don't care about that. Why am I writing that? It has nothing to do with anything. There were only 2 case studies, okay? So again, you have to be careful about transferring that information over into other populations. But on the other hand, it can be transferable because this was a big primary care setting. It was multiple disciplines. So we could probably take the results of this study and transfer them over to other primary care settings, not acute care settings, but primary care settings. I thought this was interesting because it really showed a need for awareness to be able to develop autonomous and collaborative roles for everybody to be able to work together. And to me, that was a strength of this study. I think it was very feasible. I just wrote feasible to use in my practice since it's a primary care setting. So if I did work in a primary care setting, I think it's a great article to bring into practice. And then the level of evidence, I used the AACN and it ended up being a level of evidence C. So that's quick and dirty, and I'm going to send you over, like I said, the articles and the table so you can go back into a little bit more. The thing about qualitative studies is I got to tell you there's a lot of information. It's hard to sludge through all that stuff sometimes. Okay, thanks.